I spend a lot of time backpacking, outdoors, looking at nature, spending time with nature. It's a way that I relax, I decompress, I meditate, I exercise, I go into a different kind of world, and much of my time I spend thinking about theology and philosophy, about God and big questions. So many of the photographs I want to share today come from that kind of experience. And I also want to talk about the land and the animals, because protecting them and enjoying them is an important part of how I understand life. All of the photographs, of course, that I have here are mine. And as I hike, I oftentimes ponder not only my own life, but questions about how God might be interacting and acting in the world. By the way, Regina, this is the John Muir Trail. So this happens to be in the Sierra Nevadas of California.
Early in the season.
Early in the season, yes. Yeah. Yeah, this is late June, I think it was, or yeah, something like that. The photographs that I have here are my expressions of spirituality, or the way I encounter God as I understand God, not only in the landscapes, in the mountains and the rivers, but also looking at the animals and the birds as well, like this owl chick. I made this photograph in southern Idaho. The nest was about right here, and I could just take my camera and put it up like this and snap these photographs of these. There were two chicks actually, and the mother owl was up above a little bit higher, snapping her beak at me and threatening me. And these chicks were trying to make themselves look tough by, fluffing up their feathers. It was a powerful experience. The natural world calls me to move beyond myself and think about light in a kind of way to suggest God's presence in the world, to try to train my mind to see something unusual that I might think somehow depict who God is. I don't think nature proves God. Sometimes people look at the world and they say, how can you not look at the world and believe that there's a God? It proves that there's a God. For me, it doesn't prove there is a God. I do believe in God. Sometimes in the academy, we distinguish between natural theology and theology of nature. These words mean many different things, but one way to think about natural theology is that there's a certain proof. The world shows beyond a shadow of a doubt there is a God. I don't like that way of thinking about theology. I think of more of theology of nature. That is, I look at the world, I think it provides evidence that there's a God, but I still think that we must go beyond and think about who God is in relation to the world. This particular passage from the Apostle Paul in Romans, I think, is particularly interesting. He says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen by what has been made, so that people are without excuse. I think that's a little too strong of a claim, actually. I have many friends who are atheists, who don't believe there's a God. I don't think they're foolish. I don't think they're somehow wrong in their minds. I disagree. I think there is a God. And I think this particular passage has an interesting insight. In some sense, God's invisible qualities, something you can't see, Paul says, are clearly seen. Something is going on here that goes beyond the usual way of the word see. Something is going on here where he's saying you intuit there is a God, and I do intuit there is a God. So I think the natural world gives us certain evidence without having kind of proof that God exists. By the way, I made this photograph in the Idaho-Montana border last May. And one of the things I really like about going in early to hike is that I look at the snow and I don't see any other footprints, and I kind of feel like I'm the first one for the year. You know, there's a certain amount of newness that I really like when I go into these kinds of areas. The downside is it's a lot of hard work getting through the snow, but the rewards are great. Excuse me. I like to say I make photos rather than take photos. The word take sounds to me like I'm accidentally or haphazardly, just kind of pointing my camera. But as you who are photographers know, you think about what you want in that frame. You think about the light. You think about the shutter speed. And so it's, I think, an act of art. I'm making a photograph rather than taking a photograph. In fact, I like to think that I am an artist who is a co-creator with God. I think God is the creator, but I think you and I, in fact, all creation, join in this process of creating. Yes, yes. This is in Oregon, a place called Crater Lake. It's very, very deep lake because it's in a volcano. The water is so cold, but it's a very beautiful place. As a co-creator, I think my life truly matters. I think what I do for good or for ill makes an ultimate difference. And so this is what I mean when I talk about making something. I'm producing something. It's not all God, it's not all me, but I'm co-creating with the creator of all creation. This is one of my favorite photographs because it is linked with a powerful experience. I was actually down in a valley, kind of behind here, not in the photograph, doing some work on looking at streams and trying to work some art. And I thought, well, maybe I'll drive to the top of the ridge. And I got to the top of the ridge, and this beautiful sunset began to emerge. So I jumped out of my Jeep, had my tripod, and I start running around looking for a good foreground, something interesting here in the front, so then I can have this above. And I got my Pentecostal on. I started saying, hallelujah! I was just getting so excited about the colors that were coming at me. And then in the distance, which this is fairly normal at this time of evening, the coyotes started, oh! And they call to each other at night because that's how they find each other. And I was so excited about this image and all of the things I was making. I just kind of threw my head back and I howled at the coyotes. And I felt like I was like St. Francis preaching to the coyotes and Ansel Adams trying to capture the light all at one moment. It was a mystical experience for me. And when I think of this photograph, I think of that particular moment. Excuse me. I think of landscape sometimes as kind of a canvas. And so when I'm positioning my camera, I'm asking the question, what is in the frame in this particular canvas? As I think about the beauty, what should be added, what should be subtracted, how I should adjust my camera so that I come up with something I like. Especially when I'm thinking about nature and what to add in it. And this whole process then prompts me to think not only about beauty and art, but about God and how God might be a part of this, be the author of this, the creator, the artist, and I'm a co-artist. This is actually another picture in the Sierra Nevadas, not far from the John Muir Trail. Excuse me. Of course, nature isn't always pretty. In fact, much of the time when I'm hiking, it seems kind of mundane, normal, not exceedingly beautiful, but not exceedingly ugly. Sometimes it's exceedingly ugly. Sometimes, in fact, I see death on the trail. And this might sound strange to you, but I actually like to see death. I like to see dead animals. And I think it's because I see so little death in my normal day-to-day existence. In my world, if someone dies or a cat dies, we quickly bury it, we quickly take it away, cremate it. We don't see it very often in my world. And being in nature, I feel like I'm kind of being drawn back more into reality. there's a world out there teeming with life, but also death is a reality. This particular photograph was used at a church in my area during Lent. And they liked the idea of the death here of this cow, the coyotes eaten, and then this rock in the back. We call it Three-Finger Rock. It reminded them of Calvary or Golgotha, the idea of the three crosses there. But people would meditate on that. Of course, one of the most, I think, ugliest things is when fire comes through the forest or through the desert area. You know, we talk about the necessity for fire sometimes for regrowth, and that's one way some people think about evil. I think about evil a little bit differently, and actually we're going to talk about that more on Monday here. But when I'm walking through landscapes and see this, I ask questions about a good God, a beautiful world that sometimes becomes ugly, the death that occurs, what part of that death is necessary for life, what part of it's unnecessary, what part of it's apparent evil, what part of it is genuine evil. I think everyone, well, let me start that sentence over. I oftentimes, when I'm going out, especially on a one-day hike, I have a particular idea of a photograph I think I want to look for. Ansel Adams called this pre-visualization. Thinking before you get there what might be the kind of photograph you want to make. This particular photograph, I was hiking around a mountain in Washington State called Mount Rainier. It's almost 100-mile trail around the mountain called the Wonderland Trail. And I wanted to have a photograph that showed somehow light coming into the path. That's a very classic vision or classic image of, you know, God speaking or having insight or finding enlightenment. And so when I came down the trail and I saw this light coming in from the side, I thought, this is the kind of photograph I've kind of been thinking about. If I had not pre-visualized, if I had not thought beforehand, I probably wouldn't have noticed it. So the way I'm setting up my mind ahead of time doesn't determine my photographs, but it influences what kind of photographs that I make. In fact, about 4 years ago, it was wintertime, and it snowed, a fresh fallen snow, and then the fog had come in. And so I left my house on a Sunday afternoon thinking, okay, I have snow out here, I have fog. That means I might have some interesting images in which the background could be whited out by the fog, the foreground could be white from the snow, and like a fence post might stick up, or a house or a tree might look interesting. And so I was pre-visualizing as I was going down the road what kind of images I want. And I came around a corner to find these cattle, these black cows we call Angus cows, eating grass out in the field, and the fog behind, the snow in the front. There was a little bit here I had to dodge out, but most of the photograph is right there, just kind of jumping out at me. I think I made that photograph because I was ready for it. I was pre-visualizing. I was thinking about the photograph before I even came to it. I sometimes use the word spirituality to talk about what I'm going through, doing here, because the word spirit, of course, is a way many people think about God. And I sometimes try to make images that suggest a God who is not seen. In the Christian tradition and other religious traditions, actually, we sometimes symbolize the spirit with smoke. Right? You know, you swing the smoke through the church. So I sometimes look for smoke or other kinds of things that suggest something that's not physical, but you can't, you know, if you want to show a picture of something that's not physical, you have to have something to see. And so mist or fog or smoke. I had this idea to try to show the water coming down a waterfall by, hello, by trying to show water splashing. And so I opened up my shutter a little bit longer to get some blur from the water as a way to kind of show this smoky, misty kind of emotion. We know, like in Scripture, sometimes God is talked about as breath, or mind, ruach, pneuma, wind. You know, Jesus says, you don't know where the wind comes and goes. You see the effects of the wind. Many times in the Christian tradition, we've used those kinds of images to talk about the God who is present in all creation, and yet not quite physical in the usual way we think of physical. Many cultures have looked at the world and seen unusual things, and those unusual things have sparked their views of God. This is a total eclipse that occurred 2 years ago in North America. I think it was about 2 years ago. I hiked out to a remote location that would be right in the center of the path of the total eclipse to make this particular photograph. And it was about 100 miles from where I made this photograph. This is in the Tetons of Wyoming. And I don't know, in Germany, do you have this expression when you see these rays? Do people call them God rays? In America, some people call them God rays. The idea, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously. I think God is everywhere, but traditionally we thought of God as up, and these lights coming through the clouds, people call them God rays. Anyway, this is my attempt to do a black and white Angel Adams with the sun in the Tetons in Wyoming. I like this photo too, or I made this photo as a way to try to describe somehow light coming through the darkness. Another very traditional way of thinking about God is giving insight, giving some sort of revelation in the world, and light oftentimes depicts that. Of course, I don't think we can actually photograph God. Sometimes people say to me, so you take pictures of God. Of course, I don't think that's true. I don't think God can be photographed. So one of the ways I sometimes try to suggest something spiritual, suggest something divine, is to make a photograph that's not quite, a little blurry. This is actually a reflection, a creek reflecting leaves from a tree. Some of them are in the water, some of them are in the tree and the reflection there. Something that's a little bit out of balance. In this photograph, I was working with the concept, the Latin concept, Deus absconditus, the hidden God. Many people have asked the question, why can't we see God if God is real? And one of the ways of talking about this is that God is hidden. There's an interesting debate amongst theologians about whether or not God hides voluntarily, or if God by necessity cannot be perceived by our five senses. I'm in the second camp. I think God doesn't voluntarily hide from us, but God by definition, because God is not perceptible by our five senses, cannot be seen visually. But this is an ongoing debate amongst theologians. And when I made this photograph of this deer trying to hide in these thistles, I was thinking of the Deus absconditus. Absconditus, there we go. My Latin's not working this morning so well. We live in an enormous universe, and one of the ways to depict that is to make a photograph of the Milky Way. I think God is an enormous God. One of the words theologians use to talk about God's enormousness is immensity. God is immense, filling not only everything part of this earth, but every part of our solar system, our galaxy, and I think last count there's about 3 trillion galaxies, I suspect. God is immense, present to all of them. Lots of times people talk about God as being powerful, and one of the common ways to talk about God's power is to show something powerful in nature. This is also in Yosemite, one of the waterfalls there. I showed this photograph last night. For many people, lightning strikes or a way to talk about God's power. Or this is in Hawaii, big waves crashing against the beach. I do a lot of writing about God's power and trying to think about how best to think about divine power in relation to God's love, in relation to suffering in the world. And to be honest with you, I oftentimes find myself more attracted to issues of God in the smallest things of reality, like the smallest seeds. God active at the quantum level. God active in the small, out of the way, ordinary places, things one might look. Or God active in slowly through time, as depicted in this particular tree's roots. I was photographing in Sun Valley, Idaho, and I heard a bird chirping behind me. And I turned around and here this bird was. And he was so eager to get these seeds, he let me just walk up, probably from here. I just had my camera. I even made a little video of him. I took lots of photographs. This photograph is a reminder to me that God is at work in the everyday, in the typical. I don't know about here in Germany, but this is a very common bird where I live. And I'm reminded of this passage in which Jesus says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a coin, yet not one of those sparrows falls to the ground apart from your Father's care. I think God cares for not only humans, but for every creature, the usual and the unusual. And these photographs of sparrows remind me of a God who cares for everyone, which is a good reminder some days when I'm not feeling so special and thinking about a God who cares also for me. This particular photograph is taken about an hour and a half from my house. I have this photograph because one winter I was hiking in this area. There was lots of snow on the ground, and I'm standing obviously here to make the photograph. There's kind of a cliff. You see these cliffs on this side over here? I had just made my way up that kind of a cliff here, not total cliff, but very, very steep. And the wind was whistling through there. It was incredibly cold, and I thought I need to find a little place in the rock where I can get out of the wind. And I looked over and I saw this tiny little hole over here, and I had my stove, my gas stove with me. I thought I'd go over there, heat up some water and try to warm up. So I walked along this little ledge here over to this hole, and I got there and it was a cave. And this is I call it my personal cave because only my footsteps have been in there. And I decided I sometimes go there just to kind of meditate, think about my life, think about God, think about what I should be doing, reflect on things. And I thought in order to show this, I would go and make what I call my spiritual selfies. That is some kind of a photograph that was tried to depict the inner life of what I do. So I made that one. Here's another one of me. I thought I want to blur myself out, so I had a longer exposure so you can kind of see some of me, but not other parts of me. This is actually the mouth of I came in this hole. That was the one you saw there. I decided to make one photograph of me looking out so you can have an idea of the cave. And then it goes about maybe, 40 feet this direction. Anyway, one of my favorite places. My personal cave. I don't want to give the impression that my spirituality is all about just me and going inside, because I'm very much influenced by not only the world, but the traditions that I've been a part of. And so as a way to try to make a photograph of tradition, I made this photograph of this old schoolhouse in the snow, because I think at least in America, we're a young nation. We don't have the old buildings you have here. This is old for us in America. But this is a way for me to try to depict the idea of a heritage behind me. An even better way to depict that, however, is thinking about the native peoples, what we call Native American Indians. This rock is my favorite petroglyph rock in Idaho. You can see how much work has been done picking at these various designs and things. When I think about history, I don't think just about Europeans' history, but also the native peoples and the kind of spirituality they have. In fact, there's a very remote part of my state where I found some petroglyphs, some writings on the rocks. And they're fairly common. You know, if you look for them, you know where to look. But I saw this one, and this was uncommon. I'd never seen anything like that. It looked like someone was trying to depict a person and a sun. And so I came back to my home after hiking there. I thought, I wonder if this is what's a site where you have the circles, like Stonehenge? What's that called? Solstice. A solstice site where, you know, once a year the sun comes into a particular spot. So I went back there about 7 years later, and I started crawling around, and you can see I had to crawl way down into this hole between these big rocks, and you see the light coming in from the side. I stood there for about 10 minutes looking for anything that would suggest a solstice, and finally I found it right at my feet. You see these pecked circles here? And the light I just missed the light to be in the center. I don't know if I'm the first one in hundreds of years to see this, but it was pretty cool to find that. I was like, yes! Of course, the native peoples have their own spirituality and their ways of thinking about the divine. A month ago, my wife and I drove to North Dakota, and there's a famous mountain there called Bear Butte. The native peoples, even today, hike the mountain, and they put these prayer cloths on trees. So these represent prayers from the people. So I got up very early in the morning, started hiking up the mountain so I could get hopefully some color in the sunrise, and the wind was whipping. You can see the wind is really taking those prayer cloths all over the place to make that photograph of native spirituality. Sometimes people ask me, what's my favorite photograph? And of course, I don't have a favorite, but there are certain kinds of photographs I find myself drawn to. And I thought this morning we would take about maybe 45 seconds, maybe a minute, and do a silent reflection on this particular photograph. Look at the photograph now, not from the sense of what it says to you about Romanticism or Pentecost or whatever. Ask yourself now the question, where are the elements of the photograph? Where are the things positioned? For instance, notice this is about center here. Notice I put the sun a little off center. Why do you think I did that? It looks weirder, doesn't it? It's a little off kilter, unusual, not quite right. If I had the sun right in the middle, if I had everything perfectly balanced, the photograph would feel differently. It would say something a little different. You might still think of Pentecost, but it would have a different emotional feel to it. But I purposely put the sun a little bit off center. Now it's not chaos, like it's just not jumbled up. I mean, things are kind of balanced. You've got two things here, you've got the rock here, but then you've got this off center, you've got this off center, you got one side here, but it's missing here. It's a photograph that has some balance, but some imbalance too. I don't know why, but I find myself as an artist drawn to make this kind of photograph. I don't want a photograph that's just perfect, everything, but I also don't want something that's just chaos and you can't make sense of it. somehow for me, I'm drawn to a photograph that has a kind of balance to it. Take this particular photograph. This one has more balance than the last one. This is actually another photograph I made in the Sierras. But notice I like these trees here. They're kind of moving in and out. They're not sequenced right. I've got enough trees here to give some balance, but there's also some chaos. There's things running. And then this is something I didn't notice when I made the photo. It was only after I made the photo. I have what in photography we call a leading line. Look at this line right here. It's pointing to the middle. When you have something in your photographs that point toward the middle, that's usually a good sign. You don't want them pointing off a different direction. This draws your eye this direction. So again, it's kind of got balance, but also imbalance. And then some dramatic sky, of course, that's interesting, I think. Anyway, for some reason, I'm drawn to this. I don't say it's right or wrong, it's just my aesthetic, just my sense of photography. In Idaho, we have wild horses. These are horses, large sections of land are set aside for these horses to run free. The only way they can catch the horses is to have a big roundup. And I like to go out and make photos of the horses, and I talk to animals. So I talk to the horses when I'm there, and I try to use low voices. And they have interesting ways to coming close to me, and sometimes they'll run sideways, turn, and they'll run right at me, kind of like they're threatening me. I like to make these horses photos because to me they describe a God who is wild, a God who is not safe, a God who is not easily tamed or understood. In fact, one of my favorite quotes from John Muir, in God's wildness lies the hope of the world. When I think about these wild horses, I think about that kind of an idea. A God who cannot be tamed, a God in whom we find hope in our world. I have many, 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 many horse photos. I'm not going to show you anymore, but those some of my favorite. A few years ago, a friend of mine, Leah Schweitz, who's a theologian in Chicago, she said to me, you know, I do my nature classes and I talk about God and nature, and my students, they think of Yosemite, they think of Yellowstone, they think of the Alps, they think of all of these beautiful wild places out there. I want them to think about maybe nature being in the city too. So she asked me to come be an artist in residence in Chicago. And this is one of the photographs I've made when I was in Chicago to try to find wild plants and things growing in the area. I came also in the winter time and made this photograph in one of the parks, the, I think, stark beauty of the area. Perhaps my favorite one, though, because it suggests to me kind of joy, is this photograph I made of these geese in Chicago. And this one was shaking its head, and I thought it was looking joyful. And I made that particular photograph to depict that. When I think about God, I oftentimes think about God's love. And one of the best visual ways I think of talking about God's love is to talk about a parent-child relationship, especially a mother-child relationship. The chicks from the hen, or this particular mother bear. I was backpacking with my middle daughter, and we crossed a creek, and we looked up, and there was a bear cub. I mean, between me and you guys. And I said to my daughter, uh-oh, be careful here. We don't want to get by the mother. And so, of course, I did what any father would do. I put my daughter between me and the bear, and I protected myself. No, I didn't do that. I started saying, hey bear, and I had my camera ready, and she stood up to see what was going on, and there's actually two cubs. This one was over closer to her, and I made that particular picture. But the love for a mother and its child is powerful. This is a this moose and its calf in Wyoming, I came around the corner and saw them in this field. And so I stopped and started talking to them and tried to gain their trust. And they started eating, and they didn't seem to be bothered by me at all. So I spent about a half hour with them trying to make a photograph that I liked. Of course, there's all kinds of representations we might make of the love for, the protective love for the mother, for the child. Kind of love, I think, is also expressed by God. I grew up in a farm, and on the farm that I grew up with, we had chickens, we had goats, pigs, cows, and my father was convinced that the coyotes, the foxes, were our enemies. And so we would periodically take our guns, because we have guns in America, and go out and we would shoot these coyotes. When I got older, I decided I wanted to have a different way of relating to animals. And I had been reading on virtue ethics, Aristotle and others, and I knew that certain kinds of habits would change the way I operate in the world. So I decided that whenever I would see a squirrel, a bird, even a butterfly, I would say, "Hello, friend." So I would be walking down the trail, and I'd look down, and I'd see a bug. I'd say, "Hello, friend." In fact, yesterday when I was going to the park, there were some birds in the park, and I said, "Hello, friend." It just became a very natural way for me to relate to animals and insects. "Hello, friend." "Hello, friend." "Hello, friend." One evening I was wanted to make a photograph of a petroglyph and the stars, and I had a fire, and I had this great idea of how it was going to work. And I heard a noise, and I looked behind me, and there was a coyote as close to me, to you, and walked up to see what I was doing. And I turned around, and without even thinking, the first thing that came in my mind was, "Hello, friend." And he sat down on his hind legs, took his back leg and scratched his ear like this, just right there, just right next to me. So I took my camera to try to take a picture, and he just kind of walked off into the darkness. And I thought to myself, this Aristotelian virtue ethics makes sense. It has changed my way of being in the world. My now natural reaction is not to take the gun and shoot it. It's to say, "Hello, friend." And so I try to do that when I go through and see various animals. These are bighorn rams in Wyoming. And of course, I think they're a way of talking about power, but also different forms of communities. Animals, wolves, hunt together. They have in family groups. In the bighorn sheep, at certain times of the year, all the male rams who don't have a mate all stick together in a kind of group. Nature itself suggests there are different ways that we might live in community with one another. This is another Teton photo. This particular moose was on an island in the middle of a river, and I waded out through the water to that island, and he was laying right there, and he stood up and turned around and like, "What are you doing coming out at me?" A golden eagle that I spent some time with. It was slightly injured. I finally was able to fly away from me, but before it flew away, I took a few photographs of it. This summer in North Dakota, I got out of my car and took that picture, and my wife said, "You're stupid, Tom." My wife thinks I'm not very smart. Sometimes I do things that are a little bit dangerous. I try to be safe. A few years ago, I was with my friend Carl Giberson in Kings Canyon, and we were walking through a path, and I looked over and I saw a bear out in the field, and I just had my little camera with me, and I said, "I want to get a picture of that bear." So I started running over toward the bear, and the bear saw me coming and ran away from me and climbed up in a tree. Took this photograph of the bear up in the tree looking down at me like, "What are you doing?" Excuse me. Mountain goats on Mount Rainier. Elk in Idaho as well. These are the kinds of things I titled my presentation, We Protect What We Love. I love these animals, these birds, even the insects. They come in so many different varieties, like the bald eagle. This particular deer, this is a photograph I made in Chicago. This white-tailed deer was in Chicago. This guy, I love these. They make my hair stand on the back of my neck. They can just hiss at you. But I have a trick. When I see a badger, whenever they see me, they turn and they run to their hole. So I've learned that. So now I run past them and get between them and the hole so I can make my photograph. But when I do that, they're not very happy with me. They growl at me. I don't think it's hurting them. It's just posing for a photograph.
How big is this one?
It's probably about this big. Yeah. It's like a little dog, maybe. Yeah. So, there's lots of things to protect. It's easy for me to argue to protect these beautiful animals, even ones that are angry sometimes, I think have value and I think are important. I think of life, in fact, as interrelated. We talked a little bit before about Alfred North Whitehead as a particular philosopher. You don't have to believe his philosophy. I think you can look at the world and see we live in an interrelated world. And this particular photograph is of aspen in Utah. In fact, I wrote notes down to this for this. This is determined to be the single largest living organism by identical genetic markers, and it is assumed to have one massive underground root system. It occupies 106 acres and is the heaviest known organism on the planet. It's estimated to be 80,000 years old. These trees make it because they stick together. They're interrelated. They can last the storms, the fires, because they have a root system that sticks together. I think that's a beautiful analogy for how we ought to be in life. Interconnected, looking out for one another. John Muir, when we tug at a single thing in nature, we find it attached to the rest of the world. And I think of, this is called Pandopopulus. And I think of John Muir and interrelatedness when I look at those trees. I want to conclude by looking at a few photographs related to light. Most photographers think about the light and, of course, the kinds of analogies you can use to think about light, spirituality, God, enlightenment, wisdom. They're all over the place. And I think photography is a very natural way to try to express some of those ideas, whether or not it's small bits of light or incredible displays of light, like at a sunset on the coast. It can be the kind of light that seems to be everywhere, but also the light that sometimes seems to be coming through just a little crack in the forest, giving you, quote, a ray of hope. Sometimes it's the rays of the light that show us something new in the world, or at least we see that thing in a different way. And all of these things together, I think, provide reasons for us to act for not only the good of animals, but the good of the planet, to protect that which we love, each other, other animals, other species, the smallest elements of creation, and our planet. I think at the end of the day, we will live our lives trying to save and do good to those things we really adore and admire. That's my presentation for this morning.